Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Raven, and our guest today is Rachell Kitchen. She is an author, a certified professional life and transition coach, an ICF associate certified coach, and a professional speaker. She graduated college with a BS degree in industry and technology and enjoyed a career as an industrial engineer. So that's my background. So a quick hooray for industrial
Yay.
engineers, right, Rachell?
Yes.
Rachell is also, among other things, she's the author of a book titled Doubt Your Doubts: How to Transform Negative Self-Talk, Take Action, and Confidently Create Your Dream Life. And she has a free e-course called Grow, Expand, Thrive, or GET. So we'll talk about that later, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes. So Rachell, I have no doubts that we're going to have a good conversation today. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. Thank you so much for having me.
So, as we always do here in the podcast, I'm asked to dive right in. Thinking back to your work and your career, Rachell, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Gosh, my favorite mistake was kind of a culmination of small little mistakes. And here's what I mean by that. I went through life kind of buying into societal beliefs, cultural beliefs, familiar, family beliefs about who I was and how I should show up in the world.
Mm,
And all of those kind of rolled into what I call my biggest mistake that landed me on the bathroom floor one day at work. And here's how things were playing out. My then husband and I were ready to start a family. And I expected and had all these assumptions around, hey, just because you're a career woman, that doesn't mean that you can't have it all. You can expect to have a normal, healthy pregnancy and everything go well and work right up until the time um, you have the baby and then go back to work immediately and, still flourish in your career. And I'm totally going to date myself here, Mark. There's I guess I want to say 1970s, 80s commercial. It was selling perfume, Anjali. And if people from our era probably know this, the
mhm.
tune, you can bring home the bacon, fry it up in a pan,
Yeah.
and never let your man forget he's a man. Well, I went through high school, young adult life, buying into that stereotype that
Mm,
I could be this superwoman, and that just wasn't the case. And so the day that I landed on the bathroom floor, I had a daughter. She was born 3 months early. She was 24 weeks gestation. I was still working full time in my career, and I realized uh, that mantra that I thought I was living by wasn't working.
mm.
Couldn't do it.
So tell us more about, kind of what I mean, gosh, ending up on the bathroom floor. I mean, what were some of what led to that moment? Was it in that moment that was the wake up call? Was it like immediately afterward and thinking about, gosh, how did I end up on the bathroom floor upset?
Yeah, it was in that moment. But what led up to it, at the time, I was working in industrial engineering, and that was in the early 90s. And so I was one of two female engineers in the building, in the whole entire company. And I was the only minority engineer. And so naturally in that time, I had a boss who was in his, early 60s. And the guys around me kind of created a somewhat misogynistic environment
Mhm.
for me. And I was always asked to plan the departmental social events, like the
Mm,
girly events. I would be asked to take the notes in meetings. And so we
yikes.
were in a team meeting, and yet again, my boss turned to me and said, Rochelle, take the notes. And I was like, well, hey, Ken, this guy sitting right next to me, he's got his pen. He can do it this time.
Mhm.
I did it last time. But my boss was very emphatic, and I just put my pen down. It was just like the pot was boiling over with everything
Mm,
that was going on. And just earlier before the meeting, I had gotten a call from my babysitter saying, hey, something's going on with the baby. I think I might run her over to the ER or take her to the doctor. I knew I couldn't miss the meeting. So I just gently put my pen down on my yellow legal pad, held it together until I reached the bathroom in the back of the shop floor where not many people go.
Not many
And
women using the women's room in that
yeah,
time, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I lost it, just
Mm,
lost it. And I was on the floor covering my mouth so no one would hear me wail, because I
mm,
felt like I was failing at home. When I was at home, I was worried about work. I wasn't doing what I felt I could be doing at work. And just in those moments, wailing on the bathroom floor, that's when it like hit me, like that mantra that you could do it all and be everything to everybody all the time. That's not true. And it wasn't working.
I mean, on its own, other than, as you point out, being asked to do quote unquote girly tasks instead of treating everybody equally or fairly. I mean, those things aside, was the work itself fulfilling for you at that point in your career, or were there concerns about that even?
There were concerns about that even,
Mhm.
because what I realized, I was very much a people and a connector.
Mm,
And so this is, not to paint everyone with a broad brush, but most of the gentlemen that I worked with, um, they came to their projects like, hey, I know it all, and here's the solution to whatever problem might have been going on in the production line or on the shop floor. Whereas I was very much the opposite, and I was spending time on the floor talking to the operators, talking
mhm.
to the folks who had been working on the line for 10, 15, 20 plus years, and asking them, well, how can I make this easier for you? And then designing tools and support based on that feedback. And that at the time was kind of frowned upon.
Sure. I had similar experiences in the mid 90s, at General Motors, of
Mhm.
going out and collaborating with the shop floor operators in a way that wasn't so worried about that distinction between hourly, salaried,
Exactly.
union, non-union, college educated, high school dropout. Like, at some point,
Exactly.
everyone's got a role to play, but that culture I was experiencing didn't. So beyond angles of, let's say, not respecting women, there was certainly in different manufacturing environments a disrespect, a diminishing, a disregard for
Mhm.
people who didn't have education. That didn't mean they weren't smart.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I would bring some of the concerns or ideas back to a team meeting that, hey,
Mhm.
Susie or Ed on the shop floor who's been running that machine for 15 years, here's the issues that they see, and here's how I think we can accommodate that. It was kind of poo-pooed and not
Yeah,
taken very
yeah.
seriously.
So that's maybe somebody else's favorite mistake story involving not taking that into account. So what adjustment? Well, first off, how was your daughter? I mean, there was that ER trip. Your daughter
She actually
turned out
is,
okay.
yeah, she's okay. That's my
Yeah,
miracle baby. She's,
yeah.
going to be 28 years old in a few weeks here. And she's, got double masters and finishing
Yeah.
up her doctoral program. So she's a superstar.
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear she's healthy and well. So then, in terms of your career, I mean, you hit this point. What adjustments did you make in terms of either stepping away from work, or your career has fast forwarding here to 2022, taken a different shape and a different direction? What happened next after this moment where you realized this isn't working?
Yeah, there was a series of um, leaps forward, I'll say. So in that moment, when I finally managed to get myself upright and presentable to leave the restroom, I just said, okay, what I'm doing is not working and I need to ask for help. And so I marched myself right into the president's office and said, hey, look, this isn't working. I know you hired me to do this transition of the business from one location to another. I'm still committed to doing that, but how can we do something different based on my situation? And at the time, as you probably know, in the mid 90s, satellite work and working from home type opportunities didn't really exist.
Yeah.
But I was lucky enough that the president of the company was very open minded and helped me craft an opportunity where I basically fell into an engineering consulting business, with my employer being one of my main customers. And I did that for a number of years. While that relieved some of the pressure, it still was problematic because my daughter still had health issues. So then fast forward to my then husband, we were both running for the brass ring, and he was able to advance in his career to a point where I didn't necessarily need to work. We didn't need financially for me to work. So I eventually let go of what was then IE and Associates. And of course, Associates were me, the baby, and the dog. And
Yeah.
became a stay-at-home full-time mom, I call a domestic engineer. And
Yeah.
and I wasn't just a stay-at-home mom shuttling children. I was, the head of the state PTA. I was treasurer for political action in my community and for the state, and in my heavily involved in my kids' opportunities. And so fast forward, and I call these my concentrated chaos years, Mark, because my 28-year marriage was crumbling right before my eyes. The kids had grown up and were moving, leaving the nest. And I had something very traumatic happen. My dad was beaten in the streets of Chicago and died from his injuries a few days later.
Gosh.
So I was dealing with that, and the marriage falling apart, kids moving out, and you sprinkle in a few breast cancer scares of my own, and I was a mess. But I knew I didn't want to go back into engineering. So I was hoping to save my marriage, but I actually saved myself by getting in a relationship with a coach, and then realizing that, oh, wow, I can do what she is doing and actually get paid for it, and I do it naturally. And so here I am, coach, author, speaker.
Well, it sounds like you identified, as you were saying earlier, when you were doing that engineering work, you recognized that aptitude or tendency to want to work with people in that way, maybe a less technical, more person-centered way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's good that, so thinking back to the other element of your story, asking for help is a leap sometimes. Like as adults, we sometimes get conditioned to not ask for help, or that shows weakness or failure. So it's in that moment, the fact that you asked for help and then received help, I think is a very
open to receiving help. I would say, because that was a mistake that it took me a long time to reframe and stop making that mistake, thinking that I had to do it all, or that I was somehow undeserving of help. Or as you said, if I had to ask for help, that meant I was failing.
Yeah. Well, and it's good that the company president offered some help and helped you create something that, at least at the moment, at the time, was better than what you had. Because the response also could have been, sometimes, unfortunately, asking for help doesn't mean you'll get help.
Exactly.
They might have told you to toughen up or whatever platitude would have.
Yeah. Well, my immediate boss, my direct report, told me, oh, well, you should have your husband do more so you can focus more at work.
That's some top-notch mansplaining there, right?
Yeah.
At a time before mansplaining was a common term.
Yeah.
It was certainly a thing. It just wasn't identified. I don't mean I'm not. I hope I'm not mansplaining.
Oh, you're not. I get what you're saying.
So as you moved ahead, you talked earlier about sort of the idea of letting others define your life, or defining expectations. You mentioned society, family. How did you come around to this idea of defining your own life, and not just reacting to opportunities that come up, but like setting out and looking for the boundaries of personal, work, otherwise? How do you define your life in a more personal, intentional way?
I think that way of thinking, or that idea or outlook on life, didn't really crack open for me until I got into the coaching relationship. and realizing through my own coaching with my coach that I have a choice on how I view every situation, how I view the world, the people in it, and my role in it. And I never had questioned the status quo ever before. It was, if society says you should be doing this, then that's what you should be doing to be successful. If your family says you ought to do this, then that's what you must be doing in order to be seen as, successful and contributing in the way that they think you ought to be. And I just never really questioned that. I certainly had doubts about it, but I never doubted the doubts.
And that's a really interesting, that's an interesting way of putting it. Even recognizing, recognizing that the status quo, the way it's always been, isn't the way it has to be. Or even recognizing that were there at some point doubts that held you back from taking your work and your life in that different direction?
Absolutely. Even when I fell into the engineering consulting business, and I did that all wrong. I didn't register with the state and just had a lot of issues with the business initially. But just, being told that women don't own businesses and women won't do well, you won't have the capital, just all of the kind of, standard stuff that you might hear, and kind of taking that on as truth and not questioning if that was right. Now, I have to say there was probably, for lack of a better description, a friction inside, but I couldn't identify that. Wait, something inside of me was telling me, well, that's not quite right. But I was ignoring it and not getting curious about what that was to even question it. And that made things harder. That, added pressure where it didn't need to be.
So, and I'm sure reflection on all of that is part of what led to the book. And again, the title of the book by Rachell Kitchen is Doubt Your Doubts: How to Transform Negative Self-Talk, Take Action, and Confidently Create Your Dream Life. So I as an author, I love asking other authors, like, what was the moment of inspiration to say, here's a book idea, and not just I need to write it or I want to write it, but like having the push to get the book written and across the finish line. Like, what was the spark for that?
It was really multi-pronged. Part of it was my own journey, because this is about that gremlin voice, that menacing voice that we hear in our head that tells us that we're not good enough. So it was really a three-prong. And so I share my story in the book about being able to count by fives up to 100. And I was a young child. And my teacher would often call me to the front of the class to do this. And this one particular day I messed up. And that mistake earned me a brutal public paddling in front of the whole class.
A math mistake or a behavior mistake? Not a behavior mistake, not that.
I messed up counting by fives. And now looking back at it in hindsight, the teacher was probably having me do this because we're close to the bell. She was frazzled and she just wanted to waste some time until we all got the heck out of there.
By paddling you. I mean, or that's an unbelievable. I mean, I believe you, but it's a stunning response to
paddling. And so I was living with my grandparents at the time, and I went home thinking, oh, grandma's going to let her have it when I tell her what happened. But instead, grandma stood me in front of the mirror and had me practice counting by fives. Now, she didn't do that because she was mean. In fact, it was just the opposite. She wanted me to prevent me from being humiliated and punished in the future. So what did that teach me? The message was, you have to be perfect, perfectionism. And that ruled my life for much of my young adult life. And so that, coupled with seeing that happen in my daughter. And then when 2020 hit and the pandemic, and people were really looking at, especially my clients were really looking at their lives and their careers and realizing they wanted to make a change. But what kept them from taking the step to do that was often that voice in their head. And then I started to think, because in 2020 and coming up to it, we were hearing a lot about, still in 2020 and 2021 and still even now, how the pay gap between men and women is, still an issue. Women in the C-suites is still an issue. And I started to think, wow, all of these threads might even have a common theme that is never talked about, that maybe women aren't closing the gap as quickly as the stats would suggest because of that gremlin voice, that negative chatter. And that noodling of those threads finally just said, you know what? I think I'm onto something. I'm going to research this and get this book out there.
Yeah. And for those who, I encourage you to go check out the book on Rachell's website and on Amazon. There's the illustration of the green gremlin being kicked.
Yeah, kicked to the curb.
Yeah. But before we talk more about that, like I'm still struck by just thinking of that response of somehow the teacher thinking that paddling was acceptable, or that paddling would somehow be motivating. And the thing I had to workplaces, like when you were starting your career, when I was starting my career, also in the 90s, my goodness, the verbal paddlings were really common. And it struck me, even early on in my career, of wondering, like, how do you, to some of the senior leaders I saw, just yelling and belittling people and cursing and blaming people. Like, how do you think that's helpful? I just couldn't understand.
I know, but it was, as you said, it was very much commonplace. And again, some of that had to do with their own experiences, their own upbringing, thinking that was the way to get results.
Well, and you do hear stories, even here in the 2020s, unfortunately, of technology companies and settings where people are really well educated, or you hear about this in healthcare where the verbal paddlings are still taking place. So I want to make sure it's not just a manufacturing culture of the past. I mean, it's still sadly the culture in a lot of organizations today, where you'd like to think we would progress beyond that, but it seems like there are cycles here where it's somehow perpetuated. As you're young in your career, you see successful people behaving that way, and I guess people model that behavior then as they
and
progress.
That's the messages that we get, that we think we should, in order to be a good manager, that's how it's done. And we don't question it. And we might even have doubts about it deep down, like, is that really effective? But we don't act or respond in a different way or question the doubts that we have about it, because we don't want to be shamed, belittled, and all of the things that might come along with that.
Yeah. So what can people do to I guess, first off, see the doubts in their head, and then to acknowledge that? Is there sort of an exercise we can go through? Do we just have to be aware of, like, oh, wait a minute, there's some negative self-talk bouncing in my head?
Yes. Awareness is that critical first step in taking your power back from that little gremlin in your head. And it really, you want to pay attention to your languaging. Like, if you are speaking to yourself in a way that you wouldn't dare speak to someone you really care about, that's kind of a red flag that, oh, wait a minute, would I talk to my kid or my spouse this way?
Are you giving yourself a verbal paddling?
Exactly.
In your own head.
Exactly. Yeah. And then pay attention to the words that you're using. If you are saying, I have to, I got to, I must, I oughta, think about the toddler. I often equate this to the toddler. When we tell our children, you better do blah, 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 or you gotta clean your room, what's the reaction? Is to not do what they're asked.
That's a very human response.
That's a human response. Yes. And if that's how we're speaking to ourselves, that is a cue that is the gremlin telling us, you gotta do, or you oughta blah, 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 based on some belief or idea that may not be our own truth. And so I would just say, when you are aware of that, just pause for a second and get curious as to what's behind that and what's going on.
And that's then the first step to kicking that gremlin to the curb, or at least
Yep.
having the gremlin not show up as often.
Because here's the thing, and there's a wonderful graphic inside Doubt Your Doubts that shows what happens, because there's things out there that say, oh, you can be best friends with your inner critic and that gremlin, or you can send it away and banish it forever. But that's simply not true, because as human beings, we want to be living in a growth mindset and growing in our lives and our careers. And so growth requires us to move outside of our comfort zone. And so this graphic just shows kind of a concentric circles that what's outside of our comfort zone, that's your gremlin's domain. And that's where you're going to find excuses. You're going to be worried about other people's opinions. You're going to find reasons not to move outside of your comfort zone. And that's what your gremlin wants, to get your fanny back inside your comfort zone. But if you can be comfortable with being uncomfortable long enough, you can move into the learning zone where you're going to get into that next step and be able to take responsibility for what's going on. And when I say responsibility, I'm not talking about beating yourself up and blaming yourself as the problem, but your responsibility, your ability to respond differently to that negative self-talk and do something differently that maybe you normally wouldn't do, but that's going to move you one step further. And then obviously the next phase is your growth zone. And that's where you realize your dreams and can set new goals. And guess what? When you set new goals, it starts all over. Yes, you've expanded your comfort zone, but now you're going to, if you want to continue to grow, you got to get outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And guess who's at the exit? Your little gremlin. Like, hey, get back.
Yeah. The gremlin is illustrated on the front cover of the book, seems small enough and kickable enough.
It definitely is, especially if you know what it is and you know that it's there.
Yeah. And going back a couple of minutes ago, I mean, I think, you had a clever turn of phrase I think is worth going back to there when you talked about your responsibility. What I heard you say was your response ability, your ability to respond. Like that. Yes. That's, I think, an interesting thought of, can you elaborate on that, of like our ability to choose how we respond to things that happen to us in our work or in our lives?
Exactly. Well, here's the thing. Most of us, when we hear that negative self-talk and that messaging, we react. Just in the moment, we react. And that reaction isn't always in our best interest. But if we know that, wait a minute, is that me talking or is that my gremlin speaking, trying to get me back in my comfort zone? We can then take that responsibility and again, take the moment to be able to respond differently. There's a difference between reacting and responding. And responding is much more empowering and is much more likely to get you the results that you're looking for.
Yeah. And that reminds me of, this might be an influence on you as well, because the book was really popular in the 90s and beyond. Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Effective Habits. I had a chance to see him speak once, and that was one of my key takeaways of learning to sort of create a more intentional response, of having a pause between stimulus and response, that we're sort of conditioned, or our brain has evolved to be reactive, but we also have the ability to sort of call time out, put a pause in there, and let the higher thinking part of our brain respond instead of that more primal reactive part of our brain. Do you have thoughts on other thoughts on how to better develop that habit?
I often teach my clients, I talk about realizing that you've been hit and then leaning into the feelings. We often don't embrace what we're feeling, like, oh, I shouldn't be angry, I shouldn't be sad, or I shouldn't be worried, or I shouldn't feel overwhelmed, or whatever the feelings are. And so once you understand and you recognize that, okay, my gremlin's on loud and repeat, it's really working me, we pause and be okay with recognizing your feelings, realizing you've been hit, your gremlin's knocked you in the back of the head and you've been hit, and own your feelings. And then that way it allows you to work through those in a more healthy way versus, overeating or not getting enough sleep because you're worried. And so just recognizing those feelings. And when after you've done that, then you can more objectively decide what you want to do. And here's the other thing, recognizing that doing nothing is making a decision.
Yeah.
We don't have to take action.
Yeah.
Deciding to do nothing for a minute is a decision.
Yeah. And personally, I've tried to get better at recognizing the moments when I'm just sort of amped up and that reptile brain is responding. I think back like a decade ago, if somebody would say something really nasty in my direction on Twitter, I'd be all amped up and I would reply. And I've tried to learn whether it's that or, occasionally an email situation where I'm agitated of like, you know what, take a breath, step away. There's no need to respond, or there's no need to respond immediately. You can just let it go.
Yeah. And the better we get at it, Mark, then we can really start to marry this with our highest values. Like, what value do I want to honor in this moment? And then factor that into, okay, now that will help me determine my response. And that's going to allow you to live a value-based life. It's going to allow you to be fulfilled, happier, and move you forward on your own terms.
Yeah. And so one other question about, moving forward and defining your life, Rachell, you talk about this idea of defining your dream life. Have you made good progress toward that direction? Or do you feel like you're at a point now where you would describe you are living your dream life, your best life, as some people would put it?
In a lot of areas, I am living my dream life.
That's great.
But then there's also that space where I'm in that growth zone, like, wow, I reached this. And so now I want to do this. And then setting those new goals. And of course, my gremlin, Rachel, I call her, I've named her Rachel because my name is often mispronounced. But she shows up, but I got her number now, and I recognize her no matter whether she's using her most sneakiest tactics or her loudest bullhorn. I recognize her shenanigans, and I can go, oh, I see you. I see what's going on here. And again, respond differently and respond accordingly.
And so I will admit to the listeners, the first time Rachell and I talked, I made the mistake of saying, hi, Rachel. I was just saying hi to your gremlin. That's all.
Yeah. She was like, yeah, she was on her Chase Lounge, filing her nails like, see. Small mistake, but at least not publicly. And thank you for gracefully correcting me on that. Like you said, I'm sure that's a daily thing. But Rachell Kitchen, again, has been our guest. The book is Doubt Your Doubts: How to Transform Negative Self-Talk, Take Action, and Confidently Create Your Dream Life. I should have mentioned up front, another mistake is I should have mentioned Rachell's website, which is levelupforlife.coach. And so that's the number 4, levelupforlife.coach. There's a link in the show notes, and I encourage people to go check that out and look more about the book. One last thing, Rachell, tell us a little bit about the free eCourse that you're offering. The acronym is GET. It stands for Grow, Expand, and Thrive. Yeah, it's to help you get the results that you're looking for in your life, and really helping you see places where you may be being held back, places where you'd like to grow and expand, and then giving you a few tools to help you do just that, so you can start to move toward that life. And it's a 7-day little mini drip course. You can do it within less than 15 minutes a day and get some amazing results from that. So I would highly encourage and invite everyone to take advantage of that.
Yeah, well, thank you for offering that. I hope people will check it out. And again, there'll be links in the show notes. So Rachell, thank you so much for sharing your favorite mistake story. Thank you for sharing, your thoughts and reflections. I think it's really powerful to think about, this idea of doubts and how we can move beyond that. So I really, really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was great talking to you.